Good evening and welcome to our Fact Based Discourse Initiative talk. I'm Rashri Agarwal. I'm the director of the Ed Snyder Center for Enterprise and Markets, and it's my great pleasure to kick off this event by just providing you a little bit of context of why we do what we do. In today's society, unfortunately, polarized views often get a lot of headlines, a lot of mind space. And what we stand for at the Ed Snyder Center is diversity of opinions, diverse perspectives, and the belief that rather than thinking about ourselves in a versus mindset, you against me, us against them, it is better for us to understand and appreciate other people's perspectives so long as it's done with reasonable, respectful discourse, because that is the way that we can bridge our mind gaps. In particular, what I am extremely proud of is the faculty who are willing to embody these virtues, not only in our classrooms, in courses such as Challenge Your Thinking, Challenge the Conversation, but in also hosting events like this, which can be very controversial, that are dealing with very touchy subjects, if you will, where emotions run high. And in particular, it's my great pleasure here to introduce you to Relly Rosen. Relly just received the Distinguished Scholar Teacher Award. And her research is on rejecting the zero-sum mindset. And in fact, she has been particularly passionate and also, dare I say, courageous in stepping up in terms of hosting events like this. Many of our events have people picketing outside. Today is no different. But what we do is welcome them to come into the room so long as, of course, there's respectful discourse and there is no shouting down the other person. So with that, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Relly, who's going to be the main speaker, the main moderator of this event, and then you will take it over. So thank you, Relly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rodri. Thank you, Kristen, who's helped putting this event together. Big thank you to Jacqueline. I cannot see her here. And thank you to the police who are helping us, to operation team, everyone who's been helping us with this. So happy to see many people here, and I know there's some people online for this event titled Working Across the Divide, Bridging the Divide Through Common Ground, Uncommon Courage. It is truly an honor to have this panel, incredible speakers, each representing the uncommon and so necessary courage. I've been following the work of each of those speakers in the last few years, and when we were thinking about doing such event, this is the dream panel that I could imagine. So thank you for being here. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers, and then we'll just jump in. So Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib is a senior fellow at Atlantic Council and director of Realign for Palestine, an Atlantic Council project that challenges entrenched narratives in the Israel and Palestine discourse and develops a new policy framework for rejuvenated pro-Palestine advocacy. Realign for Palestine aims to cultivate a new generation of Palestinian voices committed to a two-nation solution, nonviolence and radical pragmatism. Ahmed writes extensively on Gaza's political and humanitarian affairs, is an outspoken critique of Hamas, and promotes a radically pragmatic approach to peace and Palestinian statehood as the only path forward between Palestinians and Israelis. His writing and opinions have been published and featured across the US, Israeli, and international press, and his views are prominently featured across social media platforms. Ahmed holds a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's degree in intelligence and national security studies. He grew up in Gaza City and left Gaza in 2005. Since the October 7 massacre, Al-Khatib's life has been deeply impacted by the loss of 33 of his immediate and extended family members who were killed by Israeli airstrikes. still aims to play a part in breaking the cycle of dehumanization and defying the cycle of hatred, incitement, violence, and revenge. I've gotten to know the work of Ahmed al-Khatib following October 7th, where I've seen his posting and articles. We also assigned one of your articles in the course I'm teaching with Professor Pratiti Dastidar here that Rajri mentioned as well. I believe he's a voice to be elevated, calling for true dialogue and striving for peace. Ahmed, first, I'm sorry for your loss during the war, and thank you for being here tonight. Simon Greer is a social entrepreneur and nationally recognized bridge builder with more than 30 years on the front lines of America's most polarized conflicts. An innovator and a serial nonprofit founder, having founded 7 successful organizations over the last 20 years. He has led major organizations through reinvention and built new ventures designed to help people engage difference without abandoning conviction. He's the founder and president of Cambridge Health Ventures and the creator of Courageous Conversations at the Nantucket Project and Bridging the Gap at Interfaith America, initiatives that equip university students, industry leaders, and civic organizations to navigate divisions and solve complex problems together. Across the US political spectrum, in small towns, on college campuses, in the Middle East, and inside America's prison system, Greer has convened and hosted live dialogues modeling how curiosity and candor can coexist and span divides. In 2025, he received the Mid-South Emmy Award. Oh, sorry.
It's plenty.
Pages here. I know, it's a lot. Producing the North Carolina Listening Project. He's also a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative and serves as the managing director of the Fund for New Leadership. I have had the pleasure to attend a Heterodox Academy webinar. Heterodox is part of the sponsoring of this event, so thank you, Heterodox. We're about teaching on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and this is where I was exposed to your work, and it was truly inspiring, and I believe you represent as well the courage to work with people across the divide in so many contexts. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Van Jones, who is on the screen. Well, everyone knows Van Jones.
You don't have to read that whole long thing, whatever it is.
Yes,
I want to talk. I'm dope. I used to work for Obama. I'm on CNN. I'm dope. Let's move on.
Great. Yes,
can he see us?
This. Sorry?
Can they see us?
Yes, they can see us.
you.
You can see us, right?
Hey, brother. Hey, Simon.
Good to see you.
Yeah, I'm
All right.
dope. I'm dope. Google me. Let's move on.
Oh, yes, everyone knows you, but yeah, just so you know, it is truly a dream that you're here. And yes, it's very clear from everyone knows that you are really the one that is truly an inspiration to us all. So thank you for being with us here. Ilana Redstone is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, author of The Certainty Trap, Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less, and a scholar of social dynamics and polarization. I've had the honor to be asked to formally review her book as part of for a journal called Administrative Science Quarterly, which is one of our high-rated journals, and it was fascinating. So I'm really excited that you come and kind of dig deeper. So thank you for joining us all the way from Illinois. And Nusser Yassin is also here online.
Same thing. I'm less dope, but we can continue. I make videos.
Yes, perfect. Yes, so everyone knows him as Nas Daily. Again, many also won the award for the ADL Award for promoting coexistence and peace. So thank you for joining us all the way from Singapore. I know it's very, very early for you in the morning.
6 a.m.
Yes, and I know you have to leave in about 30 minutes. So, but every minute with you is worth it. So thank you for joining us, and we'll make it work.
Thank you. So I heard there's a protest outside.
Yes, there is.
Oh my God, that's so cool. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'd love to see that.
All right, so let us dive in. The purpose of this event is not to kind of talk kumbaya, we're all fine together, but is actually to dive deeper, to think about bridging in polarized environments, because the divide has become more than just difference in opinion. It's really kind of breakdown of the shared reality and alleged shared values. So we're going to dive deeper, hopefully, talk about fact, prefer complexity over slogans and simplicity. And after about 75 minutes, we'll move to Q&A as well. So please prepare your questions as well. So I want to start by asking each of the speakers here to say in one sentence, what is the divide, the main divide that you are waking up every morning and kind of determined to tackle? Van Jones, do you want to start?
Right now, I've been trying to get the Black and Jewish community to stop fighting, but I've been able to work across lines on criminal justice and clean energy and tech. But right now, I'm just trying to get our community to stop fighting.
Thank you. Nusser?
Yeah. So I'm going to borrow my friend Daniel Levitsky's kind of framing on this. The real divide for me is not about what God you believe in and what piece of paper nationality you hold or whatever you were lucky to be born. I think it's a cultural divide. It's a builder versus destroyer. Somebody who's excited by the future or somebody who's stuck in the past. I'm trying to bridge the gap between those two people because I think the most charged conversations and things that happen in the world are really between people that are building and people that are destroying. And if we can maybe make the destroyers destroy a little bit less and make the builders, have a bit more dialogue, I think we can have a much better bridge building. So it doesn't matter if you're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist. Don't really care. Are you a builder or you're a destroyer? And that's really the mindset that I view the world.
Thank you. Ilana?
So in terms of divides, I would say what I'm going to say might not make much sense at first, but I think hopefully we'll be able to get into it a little bit more as the conversation goes on. The way I would describe the divide that I'm most concerned with is one that is between people who think that democracy settles, the democratic process settles contested questions, and people who don't. So if you people who understand that democracy is a process for managing disagreement, not resolving it, versus people who don't. That's how, and that actually to some extent maps onto, I'm going to pronounce your name, Nasir? Nasir. How it maps a little bit onto the builders and destroyers, but that's how I would characterize it.
Thank you. Ahmed?
So I would say there are several divides, unfortunately, that are ever so present in my world. There's certainly the most prominent of which is that between what you would call the pro-Palestine and the pro-Israel communities, moving away from kind of the camps, the entrenched narratives that have hardened since October 7th, whereby there are singular truths. I want to move to multiple truths. I want to move into the gray. I want to move into a colorful world in which multiple things can be true at once without them necessarily canceling each other out. I want to deal with the divide that exists between Palestinians in the diaspora and Palestinians in Gaza in particular. There's a very significant divide in terms of how Palestinians in Gaza are misunderstood and often misrepresented. I want to bridge the gap between the Palestinian people and their issues versus the non-Arab, non-Muslim, non-Palestinian elements of the pro-Palestine community. Those are the supposed allies, many of whom are very well intentioned, but I think sometimes end up doing a little bit more harm than good. I want to deal with the divide that has made Palestine and the Israel and Palestine conflict into kind of a proxy issue between a variety of different international causes, leftist, right-wing, Islamist versus this or that. Like, I want to make this into a human rights-centric issue. So there are many divides in my world, and they intersect with each other. But yes, it's a challenge because the Israel and Palestine conflict for me is not only something that is a professional cause. It's not only something that a professional issue, rather, is what I meant to say. It's one that is my actual job. But it's also one that's deeply personal. So it's not an on-off switch. So that divide, unfortunately, is ever so present in my world.
Thank you, Simon.
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of what all these great people said. I think I work on a lot of these divides. So I was struck 8 years ago by the number of people who think they're fighting anti-Semitism, people who think they're fighting racism, who think they're on different teams, by people who work in prisons and people who live in prisons who think one's going to beat the other and then somehow the system will be better, by Israelis and Palestinians who, in my lifetime, being pro-Israel and pro-Palestine was an obvious conclusion rather than them seeming mutually exclusive now. So I think I'd spent a lot of time on these divides, but the deepest one for me is, I don't know, I think it was the morning after President Obama was reelected. I had this strange, I guess I would say, looking back on it, it seems like an epiphany now that I thought we didn't just have a political crisis in the country, we had a spiritual crisis. And the spiritual crisis had to do with the way we treat the people we disagree with. And when I said that to friends, I guess it's 14 years ago, people were like, you're weird. You've lost the plot. Like, what does that have to do with anything? And I think that's been like, I keep returning to that year after year, that the problem is that if bipartisanship is like how we work together where we agree, pluralism is the question of how we live together when we actually disagree. We don't just misunderstand each other. We're not just confused. It's not just we need better facts. We have competing worldviews. We're in some irreconcilable conflict, and we still have to share this country, share this planet, share the land. And that's at the core of that is the question of how do we treat the people when we really disagree? And I think that's the deepest conflict that I wrestle with every day.
Thank you. And I think many of you talked, there was a theme, this multiple truth, not having camps, and we'll talk about those more. Nusera, I want to ask you, what is the biggest empirical challenge you had making like a bridge building video go viral versus one that is, devices? Do you feel the algorithm kind of punishes courage or nuance, or how do you handle this?
Look, I think I know what the solution to Israel and Palestine is. And I think it lies in Silicon Valley and Beijing. I think people underestimate the power of the algorithm in today's world, and how just a couple of tweaks by a couple of engineers at TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and Snapchat could really change the world. The more opinion, like from social media, I've learned that the more opinionated you are, the more viral you get. The more extreme you get, the more viral you get. And actually, I've experienced that as well. If you look at my titles, they're all extreme. The tallest woman, the shortest man, the most amazing country, the most beautiful XYZ, right? That's superlative titles. Superlative titles do well on social media. Normal, nuanced titles do not. And so clearly, if you make anything that is taking sides in this divide, you're going to get a lot more viewership. And this is really what I struggle with the most, because the whole mission statement of what we do is to bring people together here at Nas Daily. And after October 7th, that's really unpopular. And I think there's a price to that. So how do you do it? Like, I don't actually, even though we've gotten some viral video about these topics, I don't think it's as effective as taking sides. And so my answer to you is not positive. It's a negative answer. It is extremely difficult to bring people together on social media because the algorithms are inherently designed to be superlative, extremist, one opinion, and I'm going to show you what you like and what you already agree with as an algorithm. And therefore, I'm a little bit bearish on social media, unless there is some changes that can happen in Silicon Valley.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Van, you're like Nusser, you also operate in the mass media. What do we do with the cycle that kind of rewards the loudest, most kind of partisan voice?
Well, I mean, I just approach the whole thing differently. My people are oppressed. We're at the bottom of every list, Black people, when it comes to health outcomes, income, the whole list. We're the underdogs here. And we don't have the numbers in the United States. We don't have the money in the United States. We don't have arms, whatever you want to. We don't have enough to get free by ourselves. And so the politics of liberation for my people is inherently, therefore, a politics of solidarity with others. It's inherently a politics of trying to find common ground where we can to deliver real results. What's happened in the past 10 years is that people who have responsibilities, who have to deliver scholarships to people in my community, who have to pass legislation to help people in my community, who have to actually do things to improve material conditions, have been sidelined by people who don't have to run anything but their mouths. You can now be a quote unquote leader just by having an opinion and being loud about it. But those of us who have to run institutions, who have to run campaigns, who have to run Black colleges, who have to run Black banks, who have to run Black businesses, who actually have to run things, we don't just run our mouths. And there's now a conflict because we're now, I think, being poorly represented by people who are mean, people who are who insult people, who call people racist and colonizers, and look, if you, I mean, it turns out if your politics are about multiplying enemies, which is what cancel culture is, what call out culture is, every billionaire is evil, every white person is a racist, every Jew is a colonizer, every man is toxic. Now help us and join our cause. Well, it turns out that's just not as persuasive as you might think if you're trying to build a coalition to do something. And so for those of us who have real responsibilities, we're trying to multiply friends. We're not trying to multiply enemies. And this new politics of multiplying enemies in the name of some righteous liberation that never comes, that actually pushes the help that we need and the solidarity that we need further away, is an enemy of my people. It's a barrier to survival for Black children who are stuck in the worst schools, in the worst neighborhoods, going to the worst hospitals. And so, for me, it's very simple. I will work with anybody if it will advance the interests of my people. I will work against anybody if it doesn't, which means sometimes I'm working with Democrats and sometimes I'm working against them. When Democrats were building prisons all across California, I was working against them. Sometimes I'll work with Republicans, sometimes I'll work against them. But what's important for me is the people who have very little in my community. And my generation, that's how we were judged. Could you deliver? Not could you deliver a soundbite. My people cannot eat sound bites, but could you deliver actual material results? And so people accuse me of being a bridge builder. I'll take it. I'm really just rabidly committed to the poorest people in my community.
Thank you. And I love the insight of this multiplying, your friends. I want to ask maybe Nusser another question. Can you give us a specific story or project you've done that was specifically about bridging a divide, and if there was a backlash, what was the backlash?
Maybe Ahmad, you can relate to this. When you're born and raised in the Middle East and you're kind of in the middle of the Israel-Palestine conflict, you think you're the most special guy in the world. My conflict is so special, it's so unique, nothing like it exists. And so I thought about that I thought that for a long time, until one day I found myself in North Korea and South Korea, and I went to both countries, and I was like, holy cow, these guys are the same culture, but they're so vastly different. And then I found myself in Serbia and Kosovo. And then, oh my God, that's like a mini Israel and Palestine, if not even worse. And then I made a video about bringing together Serbians and Kosovos together over a shared meal. Guess what? I started to get death threats because what is Kosovo? There is no Kosovo. There's only Serbia. And so I started to see that first of all, there's nothing special about Israel and Palestine. Number two, it's just the one that gets the most airtime for some reason. I'm not sure why, maybe because Jews are involved. For some reason, it's the one that gets the more airtime. But there's nothing special about this conflict. And every conflict when you try to bring people together, you are automatically the enemy. You are automatically the traitor. You are automatically conceding to the enemy because you see them. Seeing the enemy is a form of concession. And when I experienced that when I started making content about different conflicts around the world, I realized that's a human nature. And you should expect that. You should expect pushback if you try to bring people together. And I'll leave you with one last stat. If you look since 1948, and you probably saw the ADL speech about this, since 1948, there's been like 8 assassinations. 8 leaders were assassinated. Or actually, no, 7. 7 leaders were assassinated in the Middle East since 1948. 6 of them are because they wanted to bring people together. 1 was because they wanted war. 6 died because they wanted peace. So the message here for everybody is that bringing people together and peace and bridge building is not popular. And maybe that's why we all do it.
Thank you. So Ahmed, actually, I think it will be a good segue to you to ask you, I feel, as you said before, for you, it's not a narrative, a philosophical discussion. It is your lived experience. I feel this is what I feel from you as well. And can you briefly talk about Realign for Palestine? What are you doing there, and the notion of radical pragmatism?
Certainly. So the idea of Realign for Palestine is meant to not just be an organization or a project, just that. It's meant to be a framework. It's meant to be a prism, a way of thinking, if you will, that utilizes a variety of principles, key of which are the rejection of violence. People will tell you that those who are occupied have a right to resist the occupation. And I think violence can sometimes is not just immoral at times, but it's deeply unhelpful, and it's not a strategic option. The Palestinian people have utilized what you'd call armed resistance, violence, different forms of it, for almost 8 decades, and it has yielded absolutely no results. The more we resist, the more land we lose, the more people are killed, and the more our options dwindle. So it's the rejection of violence on multiple levels. It's the embrace of multiple truths, which is the idea that I can be pro the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. I can be pro Palestinian independence and freedom and dignity. I can be opposed to the Israeli military occupation of the Palestinian people. And you just notice I use the word military occupation because I think the term occupation itself has evolved. The Overton window over the years has now, for some people, the entirety of Israel is occupation, when the Palestinians understand that, like, ultimately we're talking about the 67 borders, we're talking about 2 states, and the Palestinians agreed to that solution. And then there's the principle of radical pragmatism, which is a multi-tier principle, but it's the art of what is achievable, what is attainable, what is doable. I think a lot of Palestinians, because of the historic and contemporary trauma, because of the challenges in the sense that the Arabs have left them behind, and the Arabs, Arab countries, not the people per se, have historically meddled in Palestinian affairs and ruined a lot of the Palestinian affairs, and put them on a path that was deeply harmful. Then there's the sense that, well, then it's the Muslim countries that didn't do anything because of, we're also Muslim people. And then there's like the UN didn't do anything. Then there's the international, blah, 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 etc. So some people just, and for some people, there's a difficulty. It's a difficult pill to swallow to say, my grandparents and parents were pushed out in 1948 and actually pushed out, like not left because the Arabs, some of my mom's extended family left because they were afraid of what was incoming. Some people did leave, either because the Arabs told them, oh yeah, we'll leave, or leave and come back in a few days, or they did leave because they heard stories about massacres or whatever. But a massive number of Palestinians were pushed out. So if I go to my grandmother and I say, I'm sorry, Grandma, you need to accept that Jews have a right to exist, and I believe that Jews have a right to exist. Just hear me out to finish the thought before you jump to any conclusion. And therefore, you're going to lose your home from which you were pushed out. That's a tough pill to swallow for someone like that. Versus, I'm like, yeah, Grandma, I'm sorry, that happened. It's war that we lost. It's the reality of where we're at. And 80 years later, there will be no return of millions and millions of Palestinian refugees or descendants of Palestinian refugees to what is now mainland Israel. So radical pragmatism says that this is impossible. This is destructive to hold on to and force poor grandma every Nakba day. Nakba is the catastrophe day. Right now there's Yom Ha'atzmaut, which is the Israeli Independence Day, that is mirrored on the Palestinian Day with Nakba, a commemoration of what is recognized as the catastrophe of 48. And so I don't want to put grandma through this annual ritual of here's your key, you're gonna return. There will be the right of return. No, grandma, you're not going to return. That's radical pragmatism. We need to move forward, not forget. We can go through the healing. We can go through a process, but that is radical pragmatism. Radical pragmatism says that there is no river to the sea, that Israel is an advanced country that has a lot that it could offer us as a nascent country. I mean, the Palestinian people's economy and welfare and prospects are intricately linked with the Israeli and Jewish people. And so let's frame that from, oh, fine, like Israel defeated us and therefore like we just have to accept it, to advanced radical pragmatism will say, no, this is actually an opportunity for us to achieve statehood, achieve progress and prosperity. And I strongly believe that there are numerous Israelis whom, if they believe that there's a willingness among a large number of Palestinians to accept their existence there, to accept that, yes, Jewish lineage and heritage does connect. There is Jewish heritage and lineage in the land. It doesn't mean, by the way, that we endorse or accept what the settlers are doing in the West Bank. That is entirely criminal, unjustifiable, and I think quite fascist, if you ask me. And there is such a sense as, I believe, Jewish supremacy and Jewish terrorism. And that's not me saying it. That's Israelis that are saying it. That's right-wing Israelis that are saying we need to do something about the out of control. So like my God, like there's so much for us to work with. There's so much for us to liberate ourselves. Once we liberate ourselves from the shackles of sloganeering and maximalism and idealism and overly simplistic discourse and rhetoric, I think radical pragmatism as a framework can place the Palestinians on a pathway whereby we can pursue our inalienable rights while also recognizing that someone like Hamas, someone like the Islamic Republic of Iran, like those actors are deeply harmful to our prospects, and that there is a pathway where we achieve our rights without that coming at the expense of Israel.
Thank you. And I think you said it in the beginning, this is what I admire about your work, this multiple truth that you're able to criticize the Israeli government when needed, to criticize, of course, the radical right, like I do, and most of the Israeli, like Ben-Gvir and all those people. And at the same time, you will call against Hamas, against radical Islamism, again, and giving more agency to Palestinians to actually work for the future. So I wonder, so do you feel, okay, give us an example of this pragmatism kind of being penalized, or how are you dealing with the people who actually say, no, we should stay in our grievances and we cannot work towards a solution for the future?
Well, I mean, the idea, basically, anytime ideology is involved, that is automatically at odds with radical pragmatism. The ideology of Hamas, the ideology of jihadism and Islamism. And Islamism is a subset that is destructive of Islam. I'm a proud Muslim. I'm not talking about Islam writ large. I'm simply talking about the worst kind of mutation of Islam as a way of justifying the unjustifiable, and saying that using the martyrdom culture, for example, saying, well, actually, radical pragmatism says, to me, the human life is the most precious element of the world and of society. I care about the lives of my family members that are lost forever, of the tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza that are lost forever, way more than I even care about thinking about the Palestinian state. That, to me, is first and foremost. I don't want a state made up of skeletons and graves. I want a state that's made up of prosperous, healthy, well-fed, well-educated people. So that's one example in which radical pragmatism, like, to their credit, as much as I think they're corrupt, as much as I think the Palestinian Authority has endless problems, and I know a lot of the leadership personally, and believe me, I'm not a fan. But what they have done and continue to do, despite all the delegitimization by Hamas, by Smotrich, by Ben-Gvir, to hold the line and say, no, we will coordinate and cooperate with Israel to prevent terrorism and violence in the West Bank. We will maintain control of the areas that we have control, however small they are. Like, we will govern our areas as best as we can, even though we have very little resources. I know that it's a thankless job. But guess what? Everybody talks about the corruption of the PA. They're very unpopular in the Palestinian street. But those same people that tell you how, oh, I hate the PA and blah, 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 but come the end of the month, they're like, all right, like, I'm eager for like my monthly salary that the PA gives me. I'm eager for like the health checkup at PA hospitals that I pay nothing for. When it comes to, we're in a college setting and in a university setting, and I think sometimes when we live too much in the theoretical and academic world, and I'm just going to be blunt, we're all adults here, we can handle ourselves. Some people here, not in this very room, but here in this broader academic realm, will promulgate resistance sloganeering and saying, no, like, there has to be truth and reconciliation in which millions of Palestinian refugees are repatriated, and right of return, and river to the sea, and one state, binational state, just like South Africa, and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, and they'll map out issues that we have here, social justice issues and causes that we have here in America. And that's not radical pragmatism. And I say, no, guys, like, Israel and Palestine is very different. The people over there, like the Palestinians themselves, you'll never meet someone in the Palestinian territories who's like, yeah, I actually want a single state with the Jew, and vice versa with most Jews that I know. Most people want their individual, separate spaces where they can express their unique national identities. So that's where academia, that's where when I said earlier, when I started, the disconnect, there's a total disconnect between many of the, and I'm putting it in quotes because the pro-Palestine community, including our lovely little protesters outside, versus the people in Gaza, like some of the folks in New York that were cheering on for Hamas. Do you know how deeply hated Hamas is in Gaza? Do you know that the people of Gaza are cursing the day that Hamas, like, they're not exactly Zionists in Gaza, but they're thinking about Hamas. They're looking at Hamas, not just from the consequences of October 7th, that Hamas handed the Palestinian people on a silver platter to the most far-right and extremist government in Israel's history, but that Hamas has squandered the last 20 years in Gaza. It is estimated that Gaza, over the last 20 years since Israel pulled out, has had more per capita invested in terms of humanitarian and foreign aid and assistance than any other conflict zone in the world, okay? More than any other conflict area. And so if you take that in account, if you actually consider those numbers, where is Gaza right now? Like, what is the status of Gaza right now? Are we going to actually, so I'll conclude by saying that radical pragmatism for me has been about, I can talk about the injustices that the Palestinian people face. I can talk about the military occupation. I can talk about the need to accelerate the pathways towards independence, dignity, and freedom and self-determination. But within the, like when we think about the imbalance of power dynamics between Israel and Palestinians, and Israel is up here and Palestinians, that power imbalance is real and it does exist. However, within said imbalance, there exists plenty of space and room for Palestinian agency, responsibility, and accountability that is not blaming the victims, that is not self-hatred, that is actually the first step to empowering the Palestinian people.
Thank you. So I'm curious, Van and Ilana and Simon, do you think pragmatism is being penalized in the academia, in politics? Van, do you think pragmatism is being punished and people are not looking for pragmatic solutions?
Yes. I want to make sure that my brother Nasir gets a chance to talk. He's on a little bit of a tight schedule. So I just wonder if we could get him in before he has to get out of here.
Yeah, sure. Nasir, do you want to?
You don't have to, Ben. I want to hear your answer. It's interesting.
They need to hear from you, though. I just want to make sure we hear from you. You are one of the world's greatest people in trying to figure this stuff out, and you've done it not just in your own country but around the world. And it's just so good to have you here. I just want to make sure we hear from you.
Thank you. What is it about pragmatism? Unfortunately, I have the same. You know, guys, as somebody who grew up in Israel, I love to disagree with people so much and debate and everything. But everything Ahmed said, unfortunately, I do not disagree with it. I agree with everything Ahmed just said, and I agree with Van. Pragmatism is being punished. So I agree with everything said.
Look, here's what I think. Part of what's going on is we have to know what we want. This is the great challenge. We now have a progressive left that we now define ourselves as anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobia, anti-polluter, often anti-capitalist. We're so good at defining what we're so good at defining what we're against that now what we're against defines us. What are we for? What do we actually want? See, the problem is if anyone can name a problem and assign blame. It's the cheapest, easiest move in politics. Here's a problem, blame the billionaires. Here's a problem, blame the immigrants. Here's a problem, blame the blacks. Here's a problem, blame the Arabs. Here's a problem, blame the Jews. The name a problem and blame somebody, the blame and shame game, is the cheapest, easiest move in politics. The hard move is to say, here's a solution. Now let's build a coalition to implement it. The minute you identify a solution, we want to put up, this many solar panels in this community. We want to get this many children healthcare. We want to get, this many, farmers the water that they need. The minute you identify a solution, you no longer want to multiply enemies. You want to multiply friends to get it done. So it's the absence of a articulable future that is killing us. Dr. King was a futurist. People mistake Dr. King. They say he was a historical figure. Dr. King wasn't talking about history. He was talking about the future. He was talking about a dream. A dream is about tomorrow. He wasn't trying to make history. He was trying to make tomorrow better. When you're trying to make tomorrow better, and the clearer you can be about what that looks like, you break out of all of this whole conversation. It's been taken over and taken down because of a lack of vision, a lack of imagination, and the replacement of hope with cynicism, especially on the left. And so, Simon Greer knows as much about this as anybody. So I'm going to shut up and let him talk. But I think the fundamental problem is, what do you want? Specifically, with numbers, measurable, what do you want? And the minute you answer that question, you are in a different reality from people who just want to assign blame. The builders, the builders, the builders, as was said before.
Thank you. Yes, and I think this all resonates. I can drop a pin here for a book by Frank Bruni called The Age of Grievance that Pratiti and I also assigned some of those to read to our students. And I think it resonates with what you're saying. It's criticizing both on the right and on the left, just the mindset of grievance as opposed to future-looking solutions. And I think it's not like coincidental that we have this panel at the business school that is usually looking for solutions. So maybe this is the reason also we are here. But Simon, I do want to go to you and ask whether people feel that you're kind of erasing their grievances by looking for future solutions.
100%. So let me just say, I think one of the cool things is this is like a world-class panel. So builders, pragmatists, you stayed so in the details. Like I was on guard for, oh, he's going to caricature it a little bit here. Oh, he's going to stretch it. I was like, oh no, he is like on the line here without giving up on his own convictions and being fair, I would say, and the rendering. Like it's world-class stuff that we see far too little of. And I thought Van's point that bridging for the sake of, we don't bridge for the sake of bridging. We bridge because we're trying to change something. And if we don't do the bridging, we just seem to be going backwards. So I appreciate what everybody said. I'm not going to spend too much time in history, but I'll tell you, in the summer of 2016, I traveled from rural New Hampshire to rural Washington State, meeting with self-described working class conservatives. And I remember the first night in New Hampshire, this guy who worked on the highway in the winters in rural New Hampshire, it's like the vein is like throbbing in the side of his head. And he says, the advocates of tolerance have become the intolerant. And I thought, it was 2016. I was like, oh, it's interesting. It became the headline of my memo. It was a memo I sent to the leading donors in the Democratic Party that Labor Day, entitled, "She's Gonna Lose." This was Hillary, not Kamala, right? Just to put us back in history for a minute. And I was attacked. You become a Trumper. You become a xenophobe. You become a racist. It's like, I'm not saying I'm voting any particular way. I'm saying this is what I've heard by traveling across America. And finally, after the election, I was asked, like, oh, how did you know? And I said, well, honestly, it's because for the first time in 25 years, I wasn't selling, I was listening. And I think that pivot is probably what has defined the last decade and a half of my work, is that my core convictions, I don't think they've changed, but the set of solutions that I used to be fixated on, because that's what we progressives believe, I just let go of them as the only solution set and became much more curious about, like, maybe people I disagree with have a piece of the picture that's going to help solve this. And the last thing I wanted to say on this front is and Ilana, maybe you want to say more about this too. The anti-pragmatists on campus, since I taught last year at UNC, I'm teaching this spring at Harvard, and I keep encountering the fear among students about asking a question that could sound dumb or taking a position that could sound unpopular. And it's on my mind a lot, like, wow, what is going on? Like, I did some crazy things in college. I don't just mean like the bad things I did in college. I mean, like, I had a class about race in America where I took out the Bible and made the argument that slavery was moral, right? And I told the Noah and Ham story to try to do it. And it was like my proudest day in college. And the room didn't really know what to do with it, but I wasn't afraid that everyone would say I was a racist because I tried to take an assignment seriously. And I'm just so struck that from the Harvard Kennedy School to the University of North Carolina, on and on, students watching, like, where's the popular wisdom in this room? And how do I stick to it? And if the group leans kind of left, I'm going to lean kind of left. And I might ask my professor afterwards, or I may explore it in private, but I do not want to get caught in this classroom saying something that is like socially unpopular. And I think that fights against pragmatism. It undermines the whole idea of learning. Like, I'm not allowed to just say, well, I don't know, I think Jabotinsky made a pretty good argument. Well, you can't quote Jabotinsky. He's a racist. Okay, you can think he's right, but it's like, he's part of the story. We should at least be able to ask about him, and you could go on and on. So I'm just struck by what it is we and all of you can do, almost to reclaim higher education as a place where it's okay to be pragmatic. It's okay to say, well, I don't know if I agree with that. I might see it this way, because without it, I just fear that we are a culture of moral grandstanding and virtue signaling is so high. And I used to just be like disrespectful, I think, of the people doing it. Maybe I've gotten a little more grounding. I'm now just struck by how scary it would be to be somebody who goes to class every day afraid that if I ask the wrong question or I say the wrong thing, my friends might turn on me. And that is not a way that we want people to live. So.
Thank you. I'm going to move to you, Ilana, in a second. But Nusera, I know that you need to leave. So I wanted to ask you just...
Apologies, guys. I'm so sorry.
No. Really, as I said, we appreciate any minute with you. But any kind of last remarks or any kind of advice on how to humanize the other, and what framework can you give us to... again, by the way, I forgot to say an anecdote that was really interesting. When I corresponded about you being here, we realized from one of our professor here that 6 years ago, one of our experiential learning group in one of the classes here worked with Alex, I forgot the last name, who was on your team on a marketing strategy. So everything kind of connected well. But anyway, sorry, I just forgot to say this anecdote. But what is one thing, if you can kind of summarize one thing you can leave us with, but what is the best way to bridge the divide, and what is the best way to humanize the other?
Look, first of all, I want to apologize for having to run because I have an engagement in the morning here, but we're already in the future, guys. It's April 22nd. I want to leave you with actually a personal experience story versus like a framework. I grew up 18 years in Israel. 18 years. 18, how many? That's roughly 6,570 days. I have 0 Jewish friends from 18 years living in Israel, and Israel is 80% Jewish. So my first Jewish Israeli friend I met at Harvard, in academia world in the United States, at age 19. I also had 0 gay friends. My first gay friend was at Harvard. My first female friend was at college. My first Asian friend, my first Black friend, my first any friend was there. And I realized my preconceived notions about every group of people was so different before I met the person and after I met the person. And I realized that all it takes to humanize billions of humans is just to meet one of them. Just meet one of them, and then you'll humanize all of them. And, I see this in China. 90% of my engineering team here in Singapore is from China, not Chinese, just Chinese Singaporean from China. And, that for me humanized 1.3 billion people in China. And so I'm less likely to go and create any content that almost objectifies the China as a country, because I know a Chinese person, a Chinese national, and they're the most hardworking, incredible humans I've ever met. And so that literally changed my perception on all of China. No matter how much media I consume in the West about how China is the danger and the villain and all that stuff, I sort of stopped listening to that because of my lived experience with one person from China. And so I've had this experience happen with people from 20 nationalities, 20 backgrounds, 20 whatever. And so I really urge people to make a friend from a different group of people. And I realized that is my role. That is my role in this planet. Is a lot of Jewish Israelis do not know a single Arab Israeli. They do not know a single Arab Muslim, period. They've never interacted with them beyond seeing them work in construction or seeing them prepare their food. Unfortunately, this is the case in Israel. And a lot of Jewish Americans as well have not had that experience of befriending or seeing an Arab Israeli or an Arab Muslim or of Palestinian origin that does not want their destruction. So that's why people like Ahmad are very rare, because when you get to know Ahmad, you're like, okay, maybe not all Palestinians want the death of me. And when you see a Nas Daily video, you're like, okay, maybe not all Arabs are bad. And I think maybe at some point, our role in this planet is to humanize our people to the world. And I think that's a very lofty mission, and I think that's a very important one. And whether we like it or not, guys, it really is not the debate here. It does feel like this is human psychology. It does feel like human psychology is, if I know somebody personally, I have a completely different outlook on their people versus if I don't know anybody personally. And so that's my role as Nas Daily. I want to create content and be a friend of everybody. I want to be a Hindu's best friend as a Muslim, and Hindu-Muslim relations are not very good. We want to work on that, and so that's why something I advise, if those that are not familiar with Nas Daily, last year I studied 6 religions in 6 months, 1 religion every month, where you go and study Buddhism and then Hinduism and Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and you go to the source, to Nepal, to Mecca, to Jerusalem. And I found that in addition to just learning about the Hindu language, billions of Hindus now see a Muslim show interest in them. And that's really, really powerful. And so you got to show interest in others, because when you do that, you humanize your people. We're not all bad, and we're not all good. We're just humans trying to get to know each other. So, so I'll leave you guys with that sort of like lesson I learned from my last 10 years of creating content at scale. And you can do this one-on-one. You can do this one-on-one in like these panels and go in university and making friends one-on-one and going to Hillel one-on-one when you're in college and going to a mosque. But I found it to be quite effective to do it one-to-many. So creating content about it can help if the algorithm supports you. And so I'll leave you with that.
Thank you so much for this inspiring word, Mr.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. I'm so sorry about this. I just had a 7 a.m. thing. I appreciate you, and I wish I could be with you in person.
Yeah, no, we wish as well. But next time.
I know. And say pass my regards to the protesters. They must be good people.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye, Van.
Bye, Nisar. Thank you. So Ilana, I think the idea of this holding multiple truths is also directly related to your book, The Certainty Trap. Sorry?
What did you say? The idea of what?
Of multiple truths, also directly related to your book. And you argue that, combating misinformation and disinformation is important, but we should be combating this certainty trap, this inclination to just always feel that we know everything and we have the right, kind of the higher moral ground. And you delineate like different fallacies: the settled question fallacy, the fallacy of equal knowledge, and the fallacy of known intent. Can you briefly describe each, providing an example, quick example of each of those fallacies?
I can. I do want to back up for a minute and
Yes,
comment
please.
on some of what's gone by.
Yes.
So a couple of thoughts. One is, I don't know if I'm the only full-time academic in this group. I don't know if maybe I am. I bear that burden, I guess. I don't see the problem as anti-pragmatism. I wouldn't characterize it that way. What I would say, and there's probably overlap here, but I would say that it's more of a problem of questioning assumptions, a sort of and in some cases an unwillingness, but more likely an inability to question assumptions and clarify thinking. I would say more than an I could be persuaded, but I don't think of it as an anti-pragmatism problem. That's sort of one thought. The other thing that I would say is this problem of the way it's described accurately and fairly, I think, as dehumanization of people who disagree with you. I think that is a very apt description, and a lot of the work that tries to get at that problem is sort of what was just being described, this kind of one-on-one. What you're doing when you talk to someone who disagrees with you is the idea is that you walk into that, you're red and blue, and you walk into that interaction, and you walk out of it sort of seeing the humanity in the person. It doesn't have to be red and blue; it could be whatever issue, and you walk out and you see the humanity, right? So as wonderful as that is, I would say there are a couple, and I am going to come back to your question. I would say there are a couple of challenges with it. One is it's not entirely clear to me if those interactions, if I'm blue and I talk to someone who's red and you convince me that you're not a monster, if I then walk out and the next red person that I talk to, do I then think they're not a monster too, or do they have to do the same sort of convincing? Does it extrapolate? Right. So that's one thing that it's never been quite clear to me how that works. The other thing I would say is about the dyadic interactions is that it's not clear how you scale that. Right. And so where does this get to? What I would say is that, and this has come up a couple of times, the problem that we're pointing to, the problem of, we think of it in terms of bridging divides, but of demonizing people who disagree, I would call it the moral condemnation of disagreement. This goes back to what I said at the beginning about the sort of epistemological problem of people who think democracy is settling questions and people who don't. Why does that have any bearing on this? Because when you think a question is settled, when you think something is settled, that is certainty. Certainty is what drives our sense of moral outrage. It's what drives our sense of righteous indignation. And it is, in fact, it does create conflict with democracy. Just as a matter of, again, democracy being a process for managing disagreement, not resolving it. And so what do you do with when you think of the problem as the people who disagree are racist, the people who disagree, and I will use my examples, I won't, there's a reason why I'm using examples from the left, but people who disagree are racist, they're transphobic, etc. That problem, that is the moral condemnation of disagreement. And the way that you can solve that at scale is by, and this is what I tried to argue in the certainty trap, is by clarifying and questioning your own thinking. So to get back to Relly's question about the 3 fallacies that I mentioned in that book, is the first one that she mentioned is the settled question fallacy, which is really just what it sounds like, which is that we treat our knowledge as, we treat our claims as definitive rather than provisional. That, by pointing that out, I am not saying that any claim is as likely to be accurate as any other. I'm talking specifically about the sort of binary switch to certainty versus uncertainty, however small that uncertainty might be, and that's a really important difference in our thinking. So that's the first one. The second one is something I've called the fallacy of equal knowledge. The fallacy of equal knowledge is this, particularly when it comes to contentious ideas, contentious topics, is the idea that if the other person just had, if you just knew what I knew, you would agree with me. That what sets us apart is actually a gap of information. I'm going to then tell you what I know, or you need to get educated, and then you will see things the way I see them. That is not, I'm not discounting the importance of education or information. I am pointing to a much narrower claim, which is that if we all had the same information, we would all agree on contentious issues, which is simply not the case. So the third fallacy is the fallacy of known intent, which is sort of, once you've exhausted everything else, you have the information, you still don't agree with me, now I'm going to draw an assumption about your intent, because other possible reason for why you would disagree with me. So that loss of the space, and this does actually now exist on the left and the right, although the asymmetry is certainly in the origin, that loss of a space for a reasonable, informed person who disagrees with me is catastrophic for democracy and for democratic trust. And that is the problem that I am narrowly focused on addressing.
Thank you. And I want to also ask you, and I remember when I read your book and reviewed the book, I also kind of felt this tension, and I also interested in other panelists' opinion. So is it okay to accept someone disagree, or do we have moral guardrails, right? We have this Karl Popper said, you don't tolerate the intolerant. So where do we put a boundary? Do we bring again, I would like to ask for others as well. Do we bring also extremes intentionally, or do we have the almost moral responsibility to elevate the moderates who are trying to bring?
I'll respond quickly. So first I would say, so the Karl Popper quote, which has a lot of power. I would say that the definition, do you have to tolerate the intolerant? It is not clear to me that there's an assumption there that somebody who is being labeled as intolerant, that there's no reason that anyone could express a view that's intolerant, that there are no values that actually could justify a position that's being labeled as intolerant. And it's not clear to me that that's the case, right? So whether it's about marriage equality, whether it's about affirmative action, whether it's about trans issues, whatever, right? The assumption is that by being labeled intolerant, that there's no principled reason somebody could hold a view that is then labeled as intolerant. And that's not self-evident to me. The other thing that I would say in terms of moral guardrails, I think there's a much bigger question in what you're asking about sort of moral judgment and how my work sort of sits at the intersection of political theory and psychology and philosophy. Political theory because of how it relates to democracy, psychology because of how it relates to moral judgments, and philosophy because of the connection to sort of how we know what we know, and epistemology. When it comes to moral guardrails, I'm going to bracket the question of whether we have any business judging each other at all. And what I would say is that, again, I'll bring it back to democracy. We can easily say that things are instrumentally wrong, and this actually, I can't remember, one of you said that something to this effect. There are certain claims that we can make about what it takes to live in a society with other people. We have to, no stealing. We can make stealing illegal without declaring that we've answered a moral question about stealing, because in order to live together in a society, it's instrumentally impossible if we don't say that there has to be some respect for other people's property. And so there's a difference that I think is lost between something that is instrumentally wrong and morally wrong. And there's that difference is something that matters.
Mm-hmm. So the instrumentally wrong with you, I mean, and again, I guess, Ahmed, maybe I'll ask you, so would you want to be on a panel with someone who supports Hamas? Or would this be intolerant for you?
I'm surrounded all the time by people who support Hamas. So I'm used to it. The issue isn't, I mean, but that's the point, is like, to your, like, theoretically, conceivably, there, within the bounds of international law, there's some acceptance of the idea that you have a right to resist when you're occupied. International law, what Hamas did on October 7th, international law does not cover going into people's homes and burning them alive and taking hostages, taking women and children. Like, that is not what happened on October 7th. Like what happened on October 7th was not a legitimate act of resistance. What happened on October 7th was there was an actual agreed upon ceasefire between the two parties, between Israel and Hamas. Hamas signed that ceasefire back in 2021. Hamas's head, Yahya Sinwar, went to Egypt and signed that with the help of Egyptian intelligence, Abbas Mansour. So there was a breaking of an agreement that was very bound to Gaza. That agreement did not talk about historical injustices that had to do with 1948. That agreement did not talk about settler violence. That agreement did not talk about all the various issues that exist in the Israel and Palestine conflict. That agreement was very specific. Gaza and Israel have a ceasefire. Khalas, that's it. So you broke a ceasefire. You went across what is Hamas governs Gaza, by the way, as part of, it's not just a resistance group. Hamas is a government. Hamas is a sovereign. It governs through the administrative apparatus of the Palestinian Authority, even though Hamas doesn't get along with the PA, whatever. But Hamas de facto accepts the 1967 borders that say, here's the West Bank and here's Gaza. So you jumped across the borders that you yourself have said you're willing to accept as Israel's borders. And then you commit something that is beyond just a military attack. You attacked a few military outposts, yes, but you went, like, you tripled for a few hours Gaza's territories, and you went into a music concert, you went into kibbutzim, you went into areas that were not in a direct act of confrontation with you. So why am I getting in the nitty-gritty of the details? Because, like, when I sit with someone who supports Hamas, or someone who will talk your ears out about the international law says the occupied have a right to resist. This didn't begin on October 7th. This began in 48. This began, like, I get that. Like I said, my grandparents were pushed out in 1948. My parents lived in actual tents in the late 40s and 50s in Gaza. Like, I don't need you to tell me this didn't begin on October 7th. But I'm saying that there's a difference between, first of all, what international law actually says versus, like, how things went down on October 7th. But even if you want to actually use international, like, what is just in accordance to international law, and, you know, like in the West Bank, for example, where there is, like, fascistic settler violence that happens across the board, there's a difference between what is just versus what is smart, versus what is intelligent. And that is where I apply radical pragmatism. When you're dealing with a government that is run by the most far-right elements of Israeli society, I mean, a government that most Israelis themselves despise and have protested before October 7th for many, many months, and protested Netanyahu and the judicial reform, etc. And you think that this is now a good time to carry out the worst single-day attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust? Like, just from a strategic point of view, our people are weak and defenseless. We don't have the weapons, we don't have the allies, we don't have the capability. So, like, that is beyond just a negligence of a dereliction of duty and a negligence of your responsibility to be a protector of our people. That is not resistance. That is suicide. That is nihilism. You thought that Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Houthis are going to save you. So I am tired of those who will play mental gymnastics with these half philosophical arguments, half legal arguments, half, it's like rhetorical arguments. And that's where it's really deeply frustrating. Now, I have no problem speaking to those who support Hamas either because they support their ideology. God help them if they support the ideology. Maybe they're just angry and upset about the Palestinian people and they feel like there's no other alternative. Maybe they are a little bit low on the information and they don't know as much of the intricacy. I mean, after all, like, I actually was in Gaza when Hamas, like, I grew up in Gaza. I didn't grow up in the United States. I saw Hamas rise to power. I saw Ahmed Yassin and Abdelaziz al-Rantisi, and I can name to you all the leaders of Hamas, the founders of Hamas, and as they were rising to power and prominence, and they were all coming to our mosque, which, by the way, got bombed the third day of the war, Al Yarmouk Mosque, because it was a major Hamas stronghold in our neighborhood. So the thing that frustrates me is when you have hordes of people after October 7th that know very little about Hamas, and I'm talking beyond Arabs or Muslims or Palestinian Americans, that then I start speaking out against Hamas and I say this is a horrendous disaster, for moral, for strategic, for this, for that reasons, release the hostages, what did you unleash? And then they want to talk over an actual Gazan who lost half of his family, who has skin in the game. My brother is in Gaza right now, running one of the largest medical NGOs. He was with his wife and the 4 children in our family home that I grew up in that was hit by an Israeli airstrike, and they pushed their way out of the rubble. that took his wife and 4 children out, and he chose to stay behind. And I got my mom out, and I got a bunch of family members out, etc. Like, he's one of many constant sources of information. 10 years ago, I tried to build an internationally run, Israeli-approved airport in Gaza to facilitate the freedom of movement, because that was an issue for patients, for students, for those seeking to do business in and out. I spoke to Sinwar 10 years ago, and that's not a secret, okay? I've written about this in Newsweek, and he was paranoid and whatever. Like, so I'm offering these opinions, and then you have folks that are online, or Hassan Piker, or Students for Justice in Palestine, or American Muslims for Palestine, and saying that I'm paid for by AIPAC because I'm against the resistance, and I am a Zionist, and I am a shill, and I'm like, who are any of you to talk over an actual Palestine? I'm deaf in my left ear because of an Israeli bombing that almost killed me and killed 2 of my friends as a young man. So like, this is where I can deal with if people want to come with evidence and logical argumentation, I will engage. If people want to come with sloganeering and they want to come with the holier than thou, I'm so pro-Palestine that, shut up, Zionist sellout traitor, then I will not only not engage, but I oscillate between engage, convince, and confront. I will absolutely confront them and tell them that they have no business talking about this issue.
Thank you. Simon, what do you think?
Well,
Do we talk to everyone?
Yeah, I think I'm on the record saying I'll talk to anyone, anywhere. So that's like a known position.
We're also recording this session, so now again.
Great. So it's on the record again. And I have talked to, people that many to my left or my right have condemned me for, like, why would you talk to those people? And I think when you said something that's really interesting, and it's, I think, where we agree on who's worth. The question for me isn't, is there a political litmus test? There's one question, which is about, like, time is precious. So why would I sit with you again and again and again for you to, like, yell at me again and again and again? At some point, like, there's other people to talk to. And I think we can fixate on the extreme, loudest, most marginal voices, and that's to our detriment. Like, I think there's no reason to be overly obsessed with the person who just keeps picking at you. It's like, let's deny them oxygen by talking to the people adjacent to them rather than obsessing about them. Okay, so but my line is more about, and you kind of said this, not what their stance is, but what their posture is. And by what I mean by that is, I have this line that I will often say, it's really important, and I think you echoed this as well, that we take seriously the things that others hold dear. So I don't have to agree with you, but I have to take seriously that this thing matters to you. I often tell the story about, I work with a lot of evangelicals. I'm Jewish. I don't think Jesus is the Son of God. They do, right? And so I'm not going to dismiss that Jesus is an important character, right? Because it may not be for me, but he is for them. I can take seriously their passion for Jesus, and that doesn't mean that I have to feel that. And so I think we have to take seriously what other people think, and if we're going to engage them in conversation, we should ask them to do the same. Right? So you can come with your extreme viewpoint. You can come with maybe it's a marginal viewpoint. But if I'm going to give you the 11 minutes to lecture me on how you see the world, will you give me the 11 minutes back? And if you won't give me the 11 minutes back, then we're not really having a conversation, right? You're lecturing. So no political litmus test, but it's our colleague, and Alana knows this guy, Tom Scott. He often says, I want to talk to people who have a generosity of spirit. Right? So you can disagree with me. You can think my facts are wrong. You can think I'm blind to the truth. But will you at least let me then lay out how I came to see it that way? And if you will, I've got a lot of patience for you. Right? If you're just there to like berate me again and again, and when I say, well, it's funny you see it that way. I was raised on this story. You're like, oh, your story's wrong. It's like, oh, okay, then we're not really talking. And since this is about engaging across difference, I think your interlocutor has to be willing to engage, right? They can't just be like a closed book. And the last thing I'd say about this, who do I engage with? It's different. Who will I engage with in private? Like, you want to seek me out, you want to talk this through, versus who will I get on the big stage with and debate, right? Because I think there is a risk that you can start to make things seem like, well, they're all just the same, right? Like those happen to be your facts, those happen to be my facts, and now we're debating those facts in public with no ability for people to discern, like, was that actually true or that's just ideology? And so I'm a little more cautious about like who would I go on a panel with, because it can say to people, we're taking these points of view seriously. But in the end, I usually err on the side of, well, here's the question for me. I don't know what the strategy is to deal with the people who you won't speak with. Like I'm waiting to hear, we're going to vanquish them. Like, great, if we could vanquish them, vanquish them. But if not, we need a way to relate to them. Go ahead, Van.
Yeah, please.
Look, this is interesting. The question is, what are we trying to do? Part of the problem is that there's this whole kind of thing around who am I going to talk with? Me. Who will I talk to? I'm so important. Who will I associate myself with? That's so important. Who would I dignify? Who gives a fuck? What are we trying to get done? If I am trying to get something done and there's somebody I need to talk to get it done, then I'm going to talk to them, period. And I think that the kind of almost dialogue industrial complex gets wrapped around a bunch of axles because so much of it's about virtue signaling and platforming, that sort of stuff. My view is very simple. Everybody sucks. Everybody sucks. There's no perfect parties. There's no perfect leaders. There's no perfect governments. It's just we are all sinners who have fallen short of the glory of God. We have a very short time here on earth. We have only a small number of heartbeats. How are we going to use them? And when, Jared Kushner called me, Jared and I were not friends at all. In fact, when Donald Trump was elected president, Jared Kushner took my boss out for dinner. My boss at the time, the head of CNN, and he told my boss, Jeff Zucker, he said, "You will have no access, CNN, to the Trump White House because you guys were too tough on Donald Trump during the campaign. And if you want any access, you have to show goodwill. And the way you can show goodwill is fire Van Jones and fire Ana Navarro, because those two were the toughest on Trump during the campaign. If you want any access, you got to fire those two." I thought that was unfriendly. I thought that was an unfriendly position for Jared Kushner to take. So I went on national television and I said, Jared Kushner needs to stop riding his tricycle around in the Oval Office and go get a real job. And we weren't friends. And I didn't agree with him on anything. Then he calls me and said, well, Jared Kushner is calling you. I said, great. I'll be happy to get on the phone and cuss his ass out because he tried to get me fired and he's a terrible person. And he says, well, Van, before you start, I want to tell you something. He said, my father went to federal prison. And as a young person, I had to go see him. I chose to go see him every weekend. And it was humiliating. And what happened to my dad was humiliating. And what I saw in federal prison, the way we treat people, is awful. And Sam Feist at CNN mentioned to me that you care a lot about people in prison. He said, I thought when my dad was in prison that somebody in power would help me. Nobody did. Now I'm in power. I want to do something to help people behind bars. And I would like, since you've worked across party lines in Georgia and Mississippi and Florida, all these impossible states, I'd like to work with you on this. And I said, shit, this is terrible. I don't want to work with Jared Kushner. My entire party hates this guy. My entire party hates his father. My entire party hates everything that they're doing. This is going to make me look like a sellout, an Uncle Tom. This is going to make me look terrible. What does it mean for me to legitimate him by talking to him. But then I thought about something. Yeah, I'm going to have some bad days on Twitter. My worst day on Twitter is better than anybody's best day in federal prison. My worst day on Twitter is better than anybody's best day in federal prison. And what right do I have to be so precious about who I'm platforming and who I'm legitimating and all these type of things when there's lives on the line and there's a difference that can be made? And so I said, look, with Jared, with you, I got 99 problems, but prisons ain't one. If you want to get something done, I'll walk across that aisle and we'll get it done. And I got beat up, mistreated, and people still call me names for it. But we got 50,000 people out of federal prison. I didn't say 50. I said 50,000 people got out of federal prison. The vast majority of them never got in trouble again. The most successful prison reform in the history of prisons, signed by Donald Trump. And when he signed it, he handed me the pen in the Oval Office. This is what we're talking about. I will talk to anybody to try to get something done for people who don't have anything. I will work with anybody and I will work against anybody. And by the way, 112 civil rights and civil liberty groups signed a petition to stop that legislation from passing. Even though it would have freed 50,000 people, they didn't want to give Donald Trump a win. So I wound up in the bizarre position as a civil rights attorney of having to put my elbow in the eye socket of 120 civil rights group to beat them to help Donald Trump pass legislation. I'm saying that because I have a big concern that we're not grounding enough of these conversations in the actual desperate work that needs to be done. I love it when we're talking about, you talked about, your family getting killed in Palestine. That's real shit. Colin Greer's been on the front lines doing really difficult stuff. He's not just up here talking, well, I'll talk to this person. Like he actually has the respect of people on all sides. And it's hard earned and hard won because he's been there. And I'm just concerned that sometimes the students might be listening to this and they're thinking about it from the wrong part of their brain. You got to think about it from your guts. You got to think about it from deep down in your intestinal fortitude. Who are you willing to get beat up for? Who are you willing to put it on the line for? Who are you willing to get to die for? And if you ask, what do those people need from you? That's your first question. What do those people need from me? Then a lot of this stuff just becomes academic because what they need is somebody who's willing to not just be in the Pentagon. Everybody wants to be in the Pentagon. Everybody wants to fight. Nobody wants to be in the State Department. Nobody wants to talk. Sometimes the most courageous person is not the one in the Pentagon. Sometimes the most courageous person is that diplomat who's willing to go and sit down and talk.
Thank you, Anne. And I think you really raised this important point. Like you said, and I was about to read in your resume about the best, what you just mentioned about the first act. And we actually show part of your video in class when you talk at the Aspen Institute about it. So I want to follow up also because I know that our students asked it in the classroom. So they said, yeah, but this was a criminal justice reform. So it's something that many people would kind of, maybe, but would you be able to pass something that is DEI related, that is much more controversial? Like they asked that, so I wanted to ask you that.
I saw that question and it made me laugh out loud, which I very rarely do. The very idea, Colin, the very idea that criminal justice reform was an easy kind of a layup, that just shows you the success of what we did. This was considered impossible. The idea of bipartisan criminal justice reform was an oxymoron in 2014 when Newt Gingrich and I started trying to figure this thing out. It was the one thing that you would never get the parties to agree on. It was much more controversial than DEI. Why? Because the Republicans had run over Democrats with this issue starting in 1988 when Dukakis got beat by George H.W. Bush over the Willie Horton ad. Michael Dukakis, governor, had freed someone who had gone out and committed a horrible crime. And George H.W. Bush used that ad of Willie Horton this person who, a formerly incarcerated person who killed someone and raped someone, horrible thing, and beat Dukakis. And so you had Republicans beating the hell out of Democrats and Democrats running from this issue, Democrats building prisons, trying to get away. This was the most controversial set of ideas. And to bridge it, we had to figure out that the Republicans did care about fiscal responsibility, prisons waste money. They did care about some libertarian issues, prisons exert too much power. Some of them were Christian conservative. They did care about grace, but it was the hardest coalition to put together. It lasted for a very short period of time. You couldn't do it right now. But when you win, everybody thinks it's easy. When you win, everybody goes, well, yeah, that was easy. But could you do this other thing? I would tell you the same principles that we used to put that coalition together could be used to restart the engine of opportunity for all. 100%. Don't call it DEI, don't call it affirmative action, call it opportunity for all. And you could get, if you sat and you listened and you figured out what do your Republican folks need, what do Democrats, yes, you could do it. But the idea that, yeah, poo-poo, that was an easy layup. Show me how you do something hard. That just shows you what happens when you win.
Yes, thank you. And I think another thing that you do, and I think part of it is because your ability to be clear, and I mean, you talked about how some people just objected because it was Donald Trump, right? And I've been following also what you were saying about the IRGC, and you were saying, yeah, you can debate whether this is the right way to confront the IRGC, but you cannot distort reality and say like that they are the victim and ignore the fact that they've slaughtered tens of thousands of Iranians. And you've been very clear to say, you know, if the outcome could have been the regime change, this would have been great for the region. But it doesn't mean that we should object everything because it's Donald Trump now. But so my question is, I guess, because I think it's hard to separate the person from sometimes could be the consequences. And how do we do that? How do we navigate this?
It doesn't matter. Like it's when people ask those questions, they're not trying to solve a tough problem. They're all when they say, well, you know, it gets back to this whole thing around you're platforming people. It's all of that is nonsense. If your child were in a burning building right now, and the only person that could help you get your child down was someone whose political views were despicable, whose personal history was horrible, and who you hated, you would not hesitate to talk to that person, to work with that person, to get your child down to safety. And the only time that you see people argue, there's a child at a burning building, and people are arguing, well, could I work with this firefighter? Could I work with this nurse because I don't agree with them? Here's what you know. It's not their child. It's not their child in that building. Those are the only people debating these points. The people for whom it is academic, and I don't mean in an insulting way academic, I mean in an abstract way academic, who don't have true stakes that are life and death stakes. Those are the people who will debate, well, I would never work with that firefighter because look at who you voted for. You sound like an idiot. You sound like a very, very small person. You should work with and talk to anybody to get help to people who need it, period. Any other conversation is a nonsense conversation by people who are not serious about change.
Thank you. Ahmed, I think it goes to what you were saying. You are the person in the, your family in the building. And yes, let's actually work with the Israelis, with the Zionists to actually work a situation. And sorry, Lana.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. There's a thread going through some of the comments that reminds me of something that I tell them. Hopefully people will see the connection, but it's something that I tell my kids. My kids are 13, 16, and 18 boys. And one of the things that I tell them is you're only the star in your own play. So, right, like this idea that we think about, I mean, I don't know if the connection makes sense, but there's something in what Van was saying about sort of how we think of the precious, the word precious comes to mind. So anyway, I tell my kids, you're only the star in your own play, sort of get over yourself. And I have to remind myself of that sometimes, although life reminds me of that many times. Also, I mean, I think, so I guess a couple of things. One, I would, this person, right? So I guess really your question was about the person versus the Yeah.
sometimes could
I mean,
be positive
right.
consequences. But
So I guess a couple, I mean, going back to this, like, you know, the people who disagree are racist, the people, so part of, there is, right. So like what I, obviously in the situations where what Van was saying, where there's, you know, your child is in a burning building or your child, right, where there's sort of life or death situations, a lot of the sort of problems that we're talking about are happening in situations that are not, so yes to everything that he said. A lot of what we're talking about is happening in conversations where there's not, the stakes are a lot lower, right? Like it's sort of in, whether it's at the dinner table, whether it's in a classroom, that's right. And so you don't have that same sense of urgency. I would say that part of what we've lost is that the stakes are just as high when we sort of do this, you know, the person who disagrees, you're racist, et cetera. And we've sort of lost sight of that. And I guess going back to this distinction between the person and the argument, I mean, I think the word was bullshit, but that there really is no difference. There really is no difference. I mean, there's this so there's something called the ad hominem fallacy, which is what you learn in lots of different classes probably teach it. And there is something to that. I'm not saying that whole concept is bullshit, but the idea that you can separate the criticism, particularly on heated issues, the criticism of a person from the criticism of the idea, it is kind of bullshit. It's something that we tell ourselves that we can do. But what are you actually doing when you say that to somebody? You say, okay, well, this idea that you think affirmative action is racist, I'm actually just criticizing, or the opposition to it is more likely that the opposition to it is racist. I'm just criticizing this idea. Well, you're basically telling the person, if you don't change your mind, then what else do I have left to conclude about you? It's sort of an ultimate, it's right, it amounts to the same thing. And so coming at it from a different way, I would say yes to the bullshit response, and I'll just end there.
No, thank you. And I think it was also one of the points in your book that was interesting. Talk about when people are afraid to actually ask a question about a specific policy of the app, for example, and because they will be named as, you know, and they actually, it makes them talk more with the people who are more extreme, and with time we get more to extremism, right? And this is also an interesting point that I think like it's kind of makes sense, but then it really, this is what happens. It's not in people's intuition to actually.
Do you want me to explain that? I mean, I'll just, right. So the point that Relly is talking about is this idea that when our social, my background is in sociology, when the norms change, right? And we can talk about where that came from. When the norms change so that people who disagree are bigots, idiots, whatever. So if I have a position that is considered immoral, racist, transphobic, etc., and I know that you see me that way, but it doesn't, you're not changing my mind. And so I'm going to use affirmative action as an example, just because it's easy and people know what it is. But if I'm opposed to affirmative action and I know that you think that I'm racist for that opinion, well, maybe I'll let you know my opinion, maybe I won't, but I'm probably also going to seek out people who don't think I'm racist for being opposed to affirmative action. Now, if opposition to affirmative action is sort of socially, particularly, especially on campuses, but largely on the left, a position that is considered racist, who are going to be the kinds of people that are willing to say, I'm opposed to affirmative action. Those are the kinds of people, and I get the sense that we've already sort of broken the swearing barrier here, right? But those are the kinds of people who are going to say, fuck your social norms, I don't care. I'm going to raise my hand and say I'm opposed to affirmative action because your costs that you're imposing, they don't matter to me. And so that person, just as a matter of logic, is more likely to hold more extreme positions. So now, not only have I found my friend who also opposes affirmative action and won't call me racist, but maybe they actually really believe that the white race is supreme, is better, is smarter, is whatever, right? I'm using that as an example, but like, again, think about how the incentives work and who's going to raise their hand once you've changed the social norms. So there is a very logical progression of what those norms do and how they push people out to more extremes.
Thank you. I think we're going to open it for Q&A because I mean we can continue for another like 2 hours, but we want to allow some Q&A. So thank you, Raquel. And say, who do you want to direct the question to, or if you want to everyone? Yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming. Really appreciate it. I think this is for all of you. My concern, I know we're here to talk about dialogue and the debate that we're having. My concern is apathy. How do we actually get more people to care about XYZ, whatever issue that we're talking about? Like, how do we, whether it's Van, how do you get more people to care about the oppression that Black people in America face? Ahmed, how do you get people who aren't Jewish, aren't Muslim, aren't Arab to care about what Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank are going through? And to care in an authentic way, to care more than just posting something on their Instagram story or liking something or talking about it with their friends, as an aside.
Well, I'll start really briefly, and please jump in here. But I mean, what's difficult is that there's a high barrier to entry in terms of you get called names, you have to first have the information, and then sometimes people just want to say, this imagery, this footage that I just saw looks awful, like a child getting blown up or a mother crying because her son or daughter were taken hostage or whatever. I'm using the case of Israel and Palestine, or what I just saw in this point in time is awful. And then it'll be like, well, actually some people will dunk on you from one direction and saying, well, this isn't enough. You need to contact your senators, or you need to do more. And we don't want you to look at us as victims. We want you to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then there'll be others who are like, you're siding with Hamas and you're terrorists and you're this and you're that. And this is fake and this is propaganda. And they all just want to kill Israelis and whatever. It's like, that's an extreme example, but like, that's very much so. Like, a lot of things happen within that spectrum. And there are a lot of students and business people and folks in the United States and elsewhere, but in the United States here, who don't really have the background or the history or the time and interest to really dig deep. And so, like, one of the things that I've been prioritizing is in the setting in which you reach people. I got started in social media, but for everything that I put on social media, there's like, for every word that I say on social media, there's like 5,000 that are spoken behind the scenes. And I go to shuls, I go to temples. I've gone to mosques in the UK. I've gone to associations. I've gone to a variety of spaces where it's like away from the cameras. There's no, and sometimes, we post about it, sometimes we don't. So maybe taking things offline, maybe letting people, it's okay to not have all the information all the time, but also having the humility, inviting people with apathy to also have the humility to take in information and to not feel the urge or the need to always comment with a strong opinion.
I was just going to add my background I was a community organizer and a union organizer, and my first job out of college, I worked for Solidarity when the trade union took over the country, toppled the Soviet Union. And I never liked apathy as a frame. Like, I think people have competing demands on their time and competing interests. And when they think their action will have an impact that matters, then they jump in. So most of the time, most social movements, most people aren't involved, like in Van's story, until the legislation is going to get signed, and then everybody's involved. But I came to believe after my time in Poland that in the end, everyday people do want to make history. Like, the average person doesn't just want to worry about their own narrow concerns. They want to do something bigger, but they don't believe there's a way to do it. And what we have to show people is that there are mechanisms that you can meaningfully participate in this. You're not going to just get insulted or called out or canceled, or it's fruitless, or everyone's corrupt anyway. That once they believe that, like, in my little bit of time, I could do something that leaves a mark, most people want to do that. And so I wouldn't call them apathetic. I would call them reasonably skeptical that there's anything worth doing. And if we can give them reasonable things to do, people want to do them.
I would add, I think that makes a lot of sense, sort of the belief that you can make a difference. I would also sort of gently, and this might not be what you want to hear, I would sort of gently push back on the framing that you try to get people to care that that's the goal. You can control what you do, and you can't control what they do. And there may be reasons that they don't care about the particular thing that you care about. So yes, I don't mean that in contradiction to what Simon said, but just as something else to think about.
Van, anything to add before I go to other question?
When you're first starting out, The key is to find the people who actually already do care and then figure out how to work well together, because that's really hard. People think that they need 1,000 people, but if you can't run a decent meeting of 4 people or 10 people, then you don't need 1,000 people. It's really about trying to find the people who do care and getting really good at working together. And then if you're lucky, maybe you add 1 or 2 people in a month. One thing that happened to us was we never thought in the Black community anybody's ever going to really care. And then all of a sudden, after George Floyd, for about half an hour, everybody cared. And we weren't ready. We were not prepared. I spent my entire career making the case that cops were brutal and racist and that prisons were brutal and racist. I hadn't been preparing myself for a moment when people would agree and ask me what to do about it. And so really, I think it's during the downtimes, it's during the trough periods where people don't care, that you can really develop yourself as an organizer. You can really develop solutions. You can really develop relationships so that when the moment does come, you're ready. And yeah, so that's all I have to say about it is sometimes people are apathetic, sometimes they're not. The question is, are you a good leader? Do you know how to lead people? Do you know how to facilitate? Do you know how to be quiet? Do you know how to talk? Do you know how to set up the chairs, blow up the balloons, sweep up afterwards? Are you a good leader? And doing that apprenticeship over a long period of time means when people do suddenly turn to you, you're ready.
Thank you. Yeah, just one. Oh, yeah, to the students.
Hello. So this question's for the panel. Anybody that'd like to take it? So many argue for a future of living under one state.
Can you speak up, please?
Sure. So many argue that we could, perhaps live together in one state solution under Israel. And I want to ask, how can we normalize these relations when we have the new Knesset law that passed about the death penalty for specific, groups of people, and saying that, essentially that our people, my Palestinian people, can go to the gallows while Israeli citizens, Jewish Israeli citizens are protected. And then, we see the declassification of them as second-class citizens, especially now with Gaza, with the ongoing slaughter. So I want to ask you guys genuinely, if you guys are considering a one-state solution, how could it be possible when, again, we're treated as second-class citizens and it's a very different equality?
Yeah, I mean, I personally have never considered the one-state solution as a reality. I've never, as I shared earlier, maybe you missed that part. I've never met a Palestinian in Gaza or in the West Bank who are pro the one-state solution. And yes, I've met a lot of Israelis who are supportive of the idea, but I also know that many Israelis, even the leftists, care about the Jewish character of Israel. And that's where I still think no matter how taboo it has become to even utter the word two-state, I will never stop advocating for the two-state solution, because I do believe the Palestinian people very much so deserve to have their own entity, their own national, sovereign, free nation and state. Without any hesitation, been very clear that this is and this is one of my chief critiques of Hamas, is that it has triggered one of the most horrendous attacks on Jewish civilians during one of the most far-right, arguably fascistic government in Israel's history. And that's not, I'm not using hyperbole in saying like they're fascists. Like some of them identify as fascists. Israelis themselves call them fascist. However, if you want to get technical with this law, it's most likely going to get struck down by the Supreme Court of Israel. And that is something that, this is why the Israeli population, half of the country, was protesting Netanyahu's attempt to subjugate the judiciary to his control before October 7th, because it's seen as one of the mechanisms of checks and balances. Israel doesn't have a replica of what we have here with Congress, the executive, the Supreme Court, but something somewhat similar. So there's near consensus that law is going to be struck down. That law was a disgusting ploy by Ben Gvir and those nasty figures to try and posture before the upcoming elections. And that even that law, actually, believe it or not, the specifics of how it is written and going to be applied it's not meant to actually execute all the Palestinian prisoners currently in Israeli jails, not even the guys that actually, if you really read the law, and I've talked to a bunch of Israeli legal experts, not even potentially the guys the Hamas Nukhba guys that went in on October 7th. So it is very much so a posture. However, point taken in that it is a disgusting trend of those guys that go beyond Israel proper's borders and go and effectuate the realities on the ground in the West Bank and encourage the settler violence and empower the settlers with guns, with army protection. And I think it's entirely fair and legitimate and reasonable to talk about all of that and to dissect it and to deal with it. But you can still deal with the totality of all of that and have the nuance of segmenting the Israeli electorate, Israeli society, understanding that Israel is here to stay, understanding that Israel is not going to be dismantled. And so when we talk about dialogue, when we talk about peace, whether some people want to have warm peace, whether people want to have cold peace, whether people want to have standoffish peace, it might take different shapes and forms. Regardless of what that actually looks like, that is an inevitability if we're going to have a separate Palestinian polity and entity where we can shape the laws in a way and the society in a way that gives our people the right to be free in our own space and our own land that's negotiated. Anything you want to add to that?
I just add, there were a number of things you said in the lead up to the question that if we had more time, I would want to follow up with you on. I think you said something about the law applying to Palestinians, but not citizens of Israel. So there were a few things like that I'd want to make sure I understood. But I'm certainly not a supporter of a one-state solution. I think what's really interesting and is the conundrum we face is that more and more there are people in both camps. I don't know if it's actually more and more. It may be consistent, who feel like the whole land is theirs. Right? That if they could have their way, right, people would want it from the river to the sea, both camps. And so the challenge here is that we have to find a two-state solution for two sets of people who might prefer a one-state solution on their own terms. But we're not going to end up in a peaceful one-state solution on my terms or on someone else's terms. And so we have to create a path forward where we can honor that you're entitled to wear that necklace and want the whole thing. And I might have the necklace and I might want the whole thing. But rather than our kids killing each other, we're going to need to live in two states where I am upset that part of that does not belong to me anymore, but hopefully I'll be able to come visit and you'll be able to do the same, because the will to have it all for ourselves is higher and higher. The need for us to share it is also higher and higher.
Audrey,
Is that fair?
thank you.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you all for your very, very insightful comments. You started the panel talking about the challenges of an increasing polarized world and where the posturing, the sloganism, all of that have it. I have one question to each of you. What sustains you in your weakest moments when you feel like you cannot win the noble cause that you're after?
The sister with the certainty. What was it? The certainty hypothetical trap. Yes. Why don't we start with you?
What sustains me when I'm in my darkest moments? I'm trying to think. I spend a lot of time on work. For me is very solitary. I spend a lot of time just writing and thinking on my own. I would say, as silly as it sounds, gratitude, which is definitely a conscious effort sometimes, but gratitude, whether it's for my job, for my kids, for my life. And sometimes sometimes to the point where I don't really know what to do with that gratitude, because sometimes I'm being grateful for things that I actually didn't have any control over, like where I was born and when I was born and who my parents, right? But I would say gratitude, because the rest, I don't know, it comes and goes. That's my thought.
If you'll indulge me, I'll tell a quick story. So I've been in this bridging business a while, and I think bridging stuff's important and all that. The deepest commitment for me comes from just before the pandemic. I was leading a delegation in Poland. It was people who were wanting to learn more about anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. And we took them to Auschwitz. So it was a winter day at Auschwitz, which is where many of my family members, my great aunts and uncles, were killed. If you haven't been there, it's like hell on earth. And it's freezing cold. And the tour guide took us to the end of the tracks where the train cars dropped off Jews who were then killed. And they told a story about a son and a daughter, a brother and a sister, who got off the train and they were separated. And the girl was taken to the crematoria and incinerated, and the son, her brother, was taken to labor, and he lived. And so that's how we know the story. So they tell the story, and all I can picture is my kids. And so I drop to my knees. I'm supposed to be leading a delegation. I drop to my knees and I just start to weep. It was like 2 minutes. My memory of it is it was like an hour, right? And it's terrible. It's cold. It's messy. And then the strangest thing happened. So my grandparents, as you now know, are from Poland. I was raised not liking Polish people and not liking Germans. Those were not, I didn't like to hear their languages. When I lived in Poland, as I told you, my grandmother was like, why would you go back there? They never did anything for us. So I stopped crying and I had the most irrational feeling, which was that it's very convenient to believe we are the good guys and the Poles and the Germans are the bad guys. I was taught that they are the bad guys, but it was like out of nowhere in the depths of hell, I had this sense that there are things that the hatred in them is a little bit in me, and that there are things that they love that I love too. And that I can try to live in a world where they're the irredeemable bad guys and I'm the perfect good guy. But the truth is, there's a little bit of the good and the bad in each of us. And once I had that feeling, which was not like a rational choice, it has animated this work. So on the days where I feel like those are the bad guys, it's like, no, but I actually know we are all bound up in this web of life in some interconnected way that I saw that day in the worst place for my people. And I can't shake it. And so even when the chips are down and no one seems to agree and I get called a sellout, and I come back to this truth that I know we have this thing in common. And so we're just fighting truth each time we pretend that you're the bad guy and I'm the good guy. I'm perfect and you're irredeemable. We're not. We're built from the same thing. We're made in the image of the same God. We share that. And so we have to figure it out together.
I'll share that it's honestly the people of Gaza that sustain me. And what I mean by that, that's not some esoteric sense. This work that I do, writing, engaging, traveling, speaking, it's not glorious. I promise you. I say one thing negative about Hamas and the Palestinian historical mistakes and the Palestinian National Project, and the pro-Palestine community just wants to get rid of me and kill me and blah, 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 blah. And the pro-Israel folks are like, oh, you're so courageous and you should be the president of Palestine. And then I say one thing about the settlers or the Israeli military behavior and Netanyahu or something else. And the pro-Israel community are like, we thought you're a real peace activist. You're so fake. You're horrible. Like Takia, you're an anti-Semite, blah, blah, blah. So there's, and of course there's love and there's people in between, whatever, but it's really not glorious. But what is, there's two elements to this that tie neatly together that honestly sustain me. Number one is that I do want to humanize, part of my mission is to humanize the people of Gaza and to dispel this notion that somehow everybody in Gaza is a resistance project, is part of the resistance narrative, is not only just part of Hamas and obviously not everybody's part of Hamas, but that the Palestinian people are so incredibly diverse. And it's ironic that elements of the so-called pro-Palestine community have this enforced cohesion, enforced conformity that wants to project a very monolithic image of Palestinians. They're against Israel. They support October 7th because of the injustices of 1948 and the occupation and settler colonialism and apartheid and genocide. Like, it's a very prescriptive. And I'm like, no, actually, there's a lot. That's not to say Gazans are Zionists or like are part of the pro-Israel. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that hundreds of thousands of Gazans cumulatively worked in Israel, had amazing relationships with Israelis. My sister, and I come from a very Muslim committed hijabi family. Everybody not just covers up, but like they probably pray 17 times a day to make up for lost prayers. And yet, we're very pro our people's legitimate fight and legitimate history and legitimate issues. But at the same time, my family, like half of Gaza, immediately don't like like I would say most of Gaza, they don't like Hamas. They don't like the factions. They have issues with the PA, but at least the PA, when it governed Gaza, it actually provided for the people. They don't want endless wars. They don't want to be part of the Iranian axis of resistance. They actually want peace with Israel. They will say that to you. They want to work in Israel, to receive treatment in Israel. Yes, they want freedom from perpetual Israeli occupation. Yes, they want to be able to go to Jerusalem, to go to the West Bank. Yes, they would like to go to Tel Aviv and Jaffa and Haifa and Akka and all of that. But it's very much so part of their desire for peace and coexistence, precisely because they've paid the ultimate price year after year. Well, precisely because they've paid the ultimate price year after year of the blockade, of the restrictions, of all the various shenanigans that Hamas has subjected them through. So I'm going to get to the part specifically. Number one is there's a shift in Gaza after this war that I haven't seen before, whereby there really is a maturation, if you will, whereby people they want to move away from the armed resistance narrative towards the nation-building narrative. They want Gaza to become the crown jewel of the Palestinian people, the pride of the Palestinian people. We overlook the Mediterranean. We want to have a seaport and an airport like we once did. 10 years ago, I tried to build a mini airport in Gaza. We had an airport that I flew into in 99 and in 2000, the Palestinian Airlines, the Gaza International Airport. So like, people are now thinking, wait a minute, no, actually, like, we want to build a compelling example of what Gaza is to show that we are nation builders. And this is what the West Bank, this is what an occupation-free, settlement-free West Bank can and should look like. And then the second component of this is the massive number of Jews, Israelis, self-identified Zionists, folks in the pro-Israel community. And I use quotes because what does that even mean? Like pro-Palestine or pro-Israel? Like it could mean different things to different people. Who are like, you're the first Palestinian I've ever spoken to. You're the first Gazan I've ever connected with. Like, you've single-handedly helped me think differently about Gazans, etc. We go to temples, we go to houses of worship. And to some people that might sound like silly, like so what? But it's planting these constant seeds everywhere to show that our people are human. We want to live. We deserve to live. We deserve dignity. We are not martyrdom projects. We are beautiful human beings. We are not represented by, I think, some of the ruckus displays that we've seen since October 7th throughout the country. And that's what I'm really motivated by, is I play a small role in shifting a certain an audience that is otherwise unreachable. And that motivates me and keeps me going.
Thank you. Van, you want to say what sustains you?
All of our ancestors have been through worse.
Yeah, true. Thank you. Maybe we'll take 2 last questions. I know we started later.
I can.
You need to hop off?
Yeah.
Okay.
Look, I appreciate being included, and I'm glad to make some new friends. Colin Greer and I have known each other for almost 30 years. And he truly does walk the talk. And I'm really, really honored to get a chance to meet other people who are doing this work. Look, if you're, I can see the panel. I can't see the students or the community members. The only thing I'll say is that the work we're describing is a lot easier than it sounds. The only reason it sounds hard is because we tend to worry about the wrong things. We tend to worry, well, what's somebody going to say? What's somebody going to think? Here's reality. Nobody cares about you as much as you think they do. Just like the sister said, like, you're the star of your own movie, but everybody else is the star of their own movie too. And so while you're spending all this time worrying about what all these people are going to think about you, the reality is they're not. And at some point, you're not going to be here. And the world's going to go on. If you got hit by a truck tonight, and I hope it doesn't happen, here's what's going to happen. People will be shocked. They'll be sad for a few days. They'll go to your funeral. They'll leave your funeral. They'll go to Denny's. They'll get something to eat. And they're going to go on with their lives. That's how life works. And so, and none of us are going to be remembered. Even people who are remembered aren't remembered. You know, if you remember, you get 3 words. Dr. King had a dream. Lincoln freed the slaves. I mean, even the most consequential people get 3 words and that's it. Nothing, the rest of us don't even count. So we spend all this time worrying about people who are not worrying about us, trying to stay in good graces with people who aren't going to care about us 10 minutes after we die. And we forget to do the good that we can do. And all the good that we can do comes from doing uncomfortable things at first, comes from doing things that somebody else didn't do yet. But that's where all the meaning comes from. And I wish we would just tell the students that. Like, yeah, sometimes people don't like you and don't like what you say, but guess what? That's going to happen anyway. You don't like everybody. You don't like everybody. Everybody's not going to like you. But can you help somebody? Can you help somebody? Because that little ripple of help might get to another person and another person and another person, and you won't get the credit. But that's really why we're here, is to put out those little ripples of help, the little ripples of hope. That's why we're here. And those of you who came to this and braved the protesters and not doing your homework right now, like, live a fantastic life. Do incredibly crazy things. Work with people who you would never think you could work with. Have the best things to say at Thanksgiving dinner every year because you're doing stuff that's just nuts. And there's no better way to live your life. So thanks.
Thank you, Vance.
Bye.
So I know there are more questions, but we will need to end. So if someone wants to speak to the speakers later, I just want to thank all the speakers again. Of course, we are not solving all the problems today, but we are, I think all of you are examples and shining stars for this bridging a dialogue, which is this Dialogue That Matters poster here. And so thank you for doing all this hard work. And yeah, hopefully we'll continue with such events. Thank you. Thank you for everything.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.